We just finished this slide and talking about the fact that bone is constructed with an organic matrix, which is collagen and the ground substance. It has specific cells, so the cells that make the matrix are called osteoblasts. And then as the matrix maturates, the cells convert to osteocytes. And then because we constantly remodel our skeleton throughout our lives, we have an additional cell that breaks down old bone matrix so we can replace and remodel. So the cell that destroys bone matrix is called a osteoclast. So we have the cells, we have this organic matrix, which is dominated by collagen fibers with the glue, the chondrogen sulfide. And then what's unique to bone compared to the other supporting cartilages that we looked at, which were the types of supporting connective tissues we looked at, which were the type of cartilages, is that we have a mineral matrix, which is a crystalline form of calcium phosphate called hydroxyapatite. And then at the end of the last lecture, we were talking about how we incorporate lead, bone, some radioactive compounds like strontium and plutonium, which are contaminants from nuclear power plants and formation of nuclear bombs. And then the other thing we're talking about is how this ratio changes as we age, which is another great example of how homeostasis changes through time. So when we're young, we have a 50-50 ratio of organic matrix to mineral salts, and the bones are much more pliable. And when we get to fractures, then we'll come back and review that and understand why children get green stick fractures, but adults do not get green stick fractures. And it's because the bones are much more pliable with the 50-50 matrix. So as we age, the organic matrix relative to the bone salts changes. And so in most of your adult life, it's a 66% to 33% ratio, and that makes the bones a little more brittle. So when we do have fractures, then instead of the bones bowing and bending like they do in a green stick fracture, they break more easily. And then as we reach our geriatric years, in elderly folks, we see a 3-to-1 ratio, where now 25% is organic matrix, 75% is the mineral matrix, which makes the bones even more fragile than they were as an adult. That's why it's critically important with elderly people that they don't fall, because falls lead to broken hips, and the mortality after broken hips is fairly high within a year, because it immobilizes them for so long that impacts other organ systems. So it becomes important in the elderly that we pay attention to that in care centers and other places. Right, so to make bone strong, what we have to do is make a very dense bone. And the very dense bone is called compact bone. And so it's dense because there are very little spaces. There are very little spaces in compact bone. And so last Thursday, we talked about the relative areas of a long bone, where the center of the bone is called the diaphysis. At each end of the bone, the bone where it articulates at a joint is called the epiphysis. And then where the growth plate was during childhood development is the metaphysis. And so we end up with one diaphysis, but a proximal and distal metaphysis and a proximal and distal epiphysis. So what we're going to see is that the diaphysis is largely only contains compact bone. And that gives the shaft of the bone some incredible strength. And as we talked about, it's hollow to lighten it. And we put fat in the hollow area, the medullary cavity. So as we move into the metaphysis and the epiphysis of long bones, then what we're going to find is a surface veneer of compact bone that makes the bone really hard to the outside. And then to the inside, we're going to find a second type of bone, which is a spongy bone. And spongy bone is more porous, hence its name, spongy bone. And then within the openings within spongy bone is where we store red bone marrow. So in labdomarl, there's a couple bones where they've been cut open. There's a couple of long bones that have been cut open. And you can actually see the relationship between the diaphysis and how it's hollow, and how the two epiphysis and metaphysis at either end contain this spongy bone. Okay? So what happens is that compact bone has a structural unit that we call an osteon. And so what we're going to talk about next is how an osteon is constructed. And then what we'll see is that spongy bone does not contain osteons. So really the difference between compact bone in its density compared to spongy bone and its more openness is the fact that one is made of osteons, the other is not. Okay. So within bone material, because we use our bone material for homeostasis, for calcium. So if you have excessive calcium in your blood for a while because of a high calcium diet, then you're going to take the calcium out of your blood and store it in your bones. And then if you become deficient in calcium because you haven't been eating well for a while, then you're going to take the calcium back out of your bones and return it to your blood. Because calcium is critically important to brain function, cardiac function, and skeletal muscle function. So we use our bone to store it in case we go through these periods of time where we don't have it well. And that's our history, because during spring, summer, and fall, food was readily available. Winter was rather a harsh time when we were living in little tiny huts without a Safeway nearby. And so we didn't have this constant ability to have good nutrition year-round. So our body's designed to do that. We're going to talk about the hormones that actually do that in a little bit. So my point is that if we're maintaining blood homeostasis for calcium by using bone, then bone has to be highly vascular. And so we have specific cavities or little tunnels through which blood vessels penetrate bone. And so one of them is called a Haversian system. And at the center of an osteon, we're actually going to have an open space. And within the open space, within an osteon, we're actually going to find blood vessels. And so we'll find arteries and veins within there, plus nerves. And so that's why it hurts when you break bones, because there's actually nerves in the bone. All right. So it's called a Haversian system because it's created at the center with this opening. And so this opening at the center right here is called a Haversian canal. And it'll contain blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. And then surrounding that, we lay down bone matrix in a pattern. And so we always start at the center. And then cells undergo mitosis and create a ring of cells that lay down matrix. And then a new ring of cells that creates matrix. And then another ring of cells that create matrix. So what we end up with are what we call concentric rings of cells with matrix in between the rings of cells. And it creates the pattern in which we see an osteon. Then an osteon itself, the size of an osteon, is going to be driven by the ability to move things from the center, the blood supply, out to these cells. So since things are moving either by diffusion or osmosis or other mechanisms, then there's a limit to the size at which an osteon can become based upon the physics of the movement of material. So they become fairly predictable in size as that. So just to recap, the rings I drew represent these concentric rings, which would contain initially osteoblasts that lay down the matrix. But once the matrix is made, then the cells convert to osteocytes. All right. And then what's really interesting is that if we look at how these osteons are organized in bone, they're organized on stress planes. And so once we figured that out, we were able to actually take bone material and understand muscle force on bone. So an excellent example, if you paid attention last week, is that there was a skeletal remains found along the Columbia about 10 years ago, and it became known as Kennewick Band. And so they've been studying his skeleton, and they're going to release a paper showing what he looked like. And then the common news report that was out was that Kennewick Band was a real buff guy. So how do they know that he was a buff guy, he had all these muscles? Because they could look at the bone structure, they could look at how these osteons are all organized and understand stress on the bone itself. And then they use a computer model to recreate the muscle mass that would have been attached to the bone. So they actually have an image of it that they're coming out with, created by a computer. Yeah. So it's pretty fascinating. And then they also use some isotopes and some other tests and looked at bone and teeth, and were able to show that he actually wasn't from the Tri-Cities area at all, that he was actually a coastal person, and he'd eaten mostly marine life such as seals all his life, and not inland wildlife. So they're actually also able to show, using bone material, that he actually was probably in transit somewhere when he succumbed to whatever he did. So kind of cool. But you can learn this from little bone and understanding how bone is put together. Right. So in lab we have a model that's very similar to this. A couple of models that are out. All right. And so all your blood vessels have to interconnect. Okay. So within bone, blood vessels have to interconnect. So osteon in this bone piece are running this way. And so the osteon is running up and down. Then this and this become those Haversham canals at the center of an osteon. So what connects one Haversham canal to the next Haversham canal are what we call Vogtman's canals or perforating canals. And they allow blood vessels to enter the bone, and then they interconnect Haversham canals, so that we end up with a interconnected network of blood vessels through our bone itself. Okay? So what we're going to end up with is a pattern to which bone grows. And so when we were first building our bone, then as the bone increased in size, we would build new osteons. Now the dilemma we have is that bone material ages. So we actually remodel our bones all the time. So when you look at bone, you can see fragments of this remodeling process. And so it's critically important that we have a balance of osteoblasts and osteoclasts throughout our lives, so that we do this normal remodeling process. And when we get to diseases, we'll talk about what happens if the balance goes astray and what do we actually see. Okay? So with an osteon, then we have this Haversham canal or central canal at the center. And then we have these concentric rings of bone cells, and then in between the bone cells, we have this area where the matrix exists. Okay? So we have this pattern to it. And then what we're going to see is that as we remodel, we don't completely destroy osteons sometimes. So sometimes we'll see like half of an old Haversham canal, and then we'll see half of these concentric rings that are built into this. And so when we see these fragments like this, they're called interstitial lamellae. So the word lamellae is a reference to where the matrix is found. So the word lamellae is a reference to that, where the matrix is actually found. Okay. And so around Haversham canals, then it's concentric lamellae. And then this is still lamellae where the matrix is found. But when we have little fragments, that's when we use the word interstitial lamellae. So how can we use the word interstitial in a way that meant between something in the past? Interstitial fluid, yeah. So it's a word we've used, meaning the fluid between cells, and so now we're saying that it's actually the lamellae between osteons. And so little fragments of lamellae between osteons itself. Okay. So when you look at the diaphysis of a long bone, the entire bone wall is constructed with these osteons and interstitial lamellae. Okay. So once you've reached your adult stature, your bones don't grow in length anymore. But what actually happens, some bones do. Your hands can grow, your feet can grow, and some face bones can grow, but long bones don't grow. Well, what happens, though, is we have to continually change based upon the forces on us. So one of the reasons why they could tell that Kennewick man was really buff is largely because of the diameter of his bones. So you can actually physically see that on x-rays if you had somebody who didn't do any exercise and then put them on a real stringent exercise regime and allow them to build muscle mass for several years and redid their bones. The bones would actually be bigger in diameter in the subsequent x-rays. So the way we grow bones bigger in diameter is we start at the edge of the bone. So bone has a tissue layer that covers it. And so the tissue layer that covers bone is called the periosteum. So peri meaning around, oste, reference to bone. The UN ending is what we saw with pericardium as a membrane. So periosteum is a reference to membrane. And then it's got two very important layers. It's got an outer fibrous layer, which would be connective tissue. And it's got an inner osteogenic layer, which is very similar to epithelial tissue. And these are stem cells. And these are the cells that throughout our lives allow us to make new osteoblasts to remodel bone, to actually make new osteoblasts to repair fractured bone, and to increase the size of our skeleton based on the relative muscle mass that is on the skeleton side. So the other way you can see what we were talking about is if you were working in a rehab center, working with people that have had spinal cord trauma, where they've become wheelchair bound. If they have paralysis and their muscles don't contract much, then their muscles atrophy and the size of their bones decrease as well over time because there's no muscle mass against it. So that's why we use some electric stimulation of muscle, like TENS units, to stimulate muscle to maintain muscle mass if we think there's a chance of long-term recovery. Okay. So what's actually going to happen is that this osteogenic layer is actually going to give rise to new bone cells. And at the edge of bone, instead of forming an osteon, the cells are going to line up along the boundary of the bone. So we end up with the cells at the boundary of the bone in layers. And so again, since we have matrix, it's going to be a lamellae. But now we have to be able to describe it different than concentric lamellae, which would be associated with an osteon, or interstitial lamellae, which would be fragments of old ones. And so the outside ones, we use the word circumferential. So circumference implies what? Around the outside edge of something. And so that's why we use circumferential on these lamellae. So we use circumferential to describe them. All right. And so what happens is, because we're looking at a diaphysis, then if we have a diaphysis like this, and we build bone because we're doing a lot of exercise, then what we're going to do is we're also going to change the medullary cavity as we increase the diameter of the bone. So instead of keeping the medullary cavity the same size, the medullary cavity will actually remodel and grow as well. So not only do we have to have something going on the outside edge of the bone, but we also have to have something going on the inside edge of the bone. So when we look at the inside of the edge of the bone, we also see cells that line up around that inside margin as well. So if these are circumferential out here, we can put powder in front of it. And these are going around the medullary cavity, so they're still circumferential. So we put inner circumferential for those. So then what we end up with is actually 4 types of lamellae that we see as we're looking at the diaphysis of a long bone. Concentric lamellae, uniquely tied into an osteon. Interstitial lamellae, which are fragments of old osteons. To the outside of the bone, we're going to see circumferential lamellae, where it shows the bone is grown in diameter. And we're also going to remodel the medullary cavity, and so we're going to have a change in this inner circumferential lamellae. So out here, we're seeing these layers right here, which are our outer circumferential lamellae. And then in here, we're seeing layers going around this medullary cavity, which would be the inner circumferential lamellae as well. As we move toward the metaphysis on long bone, so at the center of the diaphysis, which is the oldest bone, we don't have any spongy bone. So we have no spongy bone toward the center of the diaphysis. But as we get toward the metaphysis, we'll begin to pick up spongy bone kind of at the edges. So we get a little spongy bone here. So this example they're giving you here is toward the either proximal end or the distal end of the diaphysis, which is why they're drawing spongy bone in here. So if we have a membrane that's to the outside, and so we say peri because it's around, and then osti because it's bone, so osteon, then what would we call a membrane that lines the inside? What prefix could we change to tell you that it's inside? So endosteon. So what we're going to do is change the prefix and end up with an endosteon to the inside. And so all of this would be covered by a unique lining that we call the endosteon to the inside itself. Okay. Now, what's kind of cool is that bone matrix is dense. And one of the things we talked about in the first unit when we were thinking about diffusion was that the substance that something is diffusing through greatly impacts the rate of diffusion. So something will diffuse through a gas much more readily than a liquid. So if you have gaseous oxygen, something will diffuse through it very quickly versus water, which you won't. So the dilemma we have is trying to diffuse things from here to these outside cells. Well, when we normally think of the way cells interact, when we produce new cells, the 2 daughter cells that arise from a single cell, we usually think of them going through a process called cytokinesis, where they completely separate. Bone does not do that. So what actually happens with bone is that when we produce new osteoblasts, they actually have little cytoplasmic streams that interconnect them. So they don't completely separate. So the little cytoplasmic streams that connect cells together are these little streams of cytoplasm here, which are called canaliculi. So it sounds kind of like, can I lick your eye? Can I lick your eye? Right. And what that does is allow material to move through a fluid medium, which allows an increased rate of diffusion. And then instead of trying to move through a more solid jelly-like medium, which is what the chondroitin sulfate is, that's tying the bone matrix together. So it's critically important that bone cells are interconnected with these canaliculi to help movement of material through an aqueous media in the cytoplasm. Yes?
I'm hitting head.
Pardon?
The camera. Someone's head is in the way, so you can either move the stuff up or... Yeah. Thanks.
Just draw a picture of it. Okay. So one of the things we're going to do in the fourth lab is we're actually going to look at bone. And so what we're going to have is a slide where they've actually taken a little tiny piece of bone and put it on the slide. And then it allows us to actually see this in bone matrix. So the way they make the slide is they take some bone, they stick it in a solution of silver nitrate, and then they run electricity through the bone itself. And so anything that conducts electricity, which in living material is the plasma membranes of cells, then we'll plate the silver, and the silver will look black. And that's how we can do that. So what actually happened is all of this black stuff is membrane material. And so we can see that the central canal actually had these blood vessels that contain cells that had membranes, so they stained dark. You can actually see the space where the cells actually existed in the matrix, osteoblasts initially, osteocytes secondarily. And then what was the space where cells existed in cartilage? Lacuna. So we're going to continue that. So where cells exist in bone matrix is still a lacuna. All right. So on this picture, what we're actually seeing is the space where the cells existed, lacuna, and then we can actually see how the cytoplasmic streams are connecting this cell to this cell. The canaliculi, we can actually see. So what we end up with are concentric rings of bone cells with concentric lamellae between them, which is where the bone matrix is. And then the size at which they can become is based upon the ability to move material from here to these outermost cells. So when you look at the slide next week, this is what you're going to see on Monday, is you'll see a bunch of osteons. And when you're looking at an osteon, you see this perfect center, which is the Haversham canal or central canal. So we can see concentric lamellae around it. So here's an osteon, here's an osteon, here's an osteon. But look at here. Here's a half osteon like I drew over here. So this is a fragment from a remodeling process. So then this lamellae is referred to as interstitial lamellae. So when we look at bone, it'll be a repeated pattern of osteons with interstitial lamellae in the remodeling process. So this is actually an enlarged view, again, where we have an osteon here, an osteon here, an osteon here. So all this stuff in between is interstitial lamellae. Now, what's kind of cool is there's a webpage you go out to called Lumen, which I thought was great because a lumen is a space in a tube. So this guy's webpage is a space on the web. It's fun. All kinds of cool. So I guess you have to be a science movie. So he's got all kinds of cool pictures up there. So I brought some pictures. So anyway, this was kind of cool because when I first looked at it, I missed this. But this is actually an osteoclast that was beginning to digest a new hole in bone for a remodeling process. So look, this cell is a very different shape from these cells. Really cool. So this is just a high-power view of what we're looking at. So the Haversham canal is at the top. Here we can see our concentric rings of bone, the canaliculi going between in the Haversham system itself. So spongy bone is put together so that the bone grows with these little spicules, and you have a lot of open space between the spicules of bone. And then that's where we store bone marrow. So the little spicules are called trabecula. So the bridge-like pattern of bone in spongy bone are called trabeculae. And just as a reference, in the future, we'll see the word used in a couple of other organ systems. And it's all going to be used because of a bridge-like effect in the tissue itself. So the trabeculae are used in that. So what we end up with is, because these trabeculae never get very large, then we don't have to have blood supply at the center supplying this structure. And so what we end up with then is a endosteum to the outside of this, and that's where the blood supply is. And then we just make a pattern of cells and interstitial lamellae. So interstitial lamellae is used in two different ways. It's the fragments of old bone repair and remodeling in compact bone. And the only type of lamellae we have in spongy bone is interstitial lamellae. So it's the common lamellae between compact bone and spongy bone. And in spongy bone, we have no concentric lamellae, we have no circumferential lamellae, inner or outer. So out of the 4 types of lamellae, the one that's common across both types of bone is interstitial lamellae. And then, because of that, then these trabeculae are going to be fairly defined in size because of the ability to move nutrients through them as well within spongy bone. So we find spongy bone in the ends of all of our long bones, and then every other bone in your body is going to contain spongy bone. So like your finger bones have a surface of compact bone and are completely filled with spongy bone. The skull we were looking at has a compact bone surface to the outside, compact bone surface to the inside, and what's between the two layers of compact bone is spongy bone. So those really flat bones that we looked at in the skull are like bone sandwiches with compact bone to the outside, compact bone to the inside, creating that hard surface that we were looking at. And if we cut them open, we would just see a layer of spongy bone in between. So we end up with this cool pattern. And then that would be true of all of our bones. The vertebrae we were looking at yesterday, the body of the vertebrae is going to contain spongy bone to the inside. The ribs we were looking at yesterday would have compact bone on the outside, but spongy bone on the inside. The sternum we looked at yesterday, compact bone on the outside, spongy bone on the inside. So I have this enormous amount of spongy bone where we have red bone marrow. And that's what allows us to make 2 million red blood cells per second. Is that enormous amount of bone marrow and the storage capacity we actually have for it. And then it's the trabeculae that would cross the gap between the compact bone on the outside that actually gives really good strength to bone, by creating a stretch. All right, so now that we've kind of talked about how bone is constructed, and we know we have 2 types of bone, compact bone and spongy bone. And hopefully now we have a pattern to that, where compact bone is on the outside of all bones. It's the only bone found in the diaphysis of long bones. And spongy bone is always internal, where it's protected. Then we can begin to think about how we began the process of creating bone. And the process was very incomplete when you were born. And you still have a lot of bone creation to do as you maturated from a neonate, a newborn baby, to your adult stature that you exist in today. And then there's a difference in pattern where women maturate at a more rapid rate than men do. So women typically have reached their adult stature by 15, 16, 17, where men usually don't reach their adult stature till 19, 20, 21. So there's a big difference between the pattern in which this occurs. And so what actually happens is we undergo a process of forming bone. So the word we use that implies forming bone is ossification. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with a embryonic tissue, and then we're going to convert that embryonic tissue to bone. So as we convert a tissue to a bone, the process is called ossification. And we do it in two ways. So we do it in intermembranous ossification, where we ossify fibrous connective tissue. And then we do it in endochondral ossification, where we actually create hyaline cartilage first, and then we convert the hyaline cartilage to bone. So endo within chondro cartilage. So endochondral ossification is actually the conversion of cartilage to bone. Intermembranous ossification is converting a layer of connective tissue into bone. Most of your body is done with endochondral ossification, and only the areas of your skull and your clavicle, which is the op bone, are done with intermembranous ossification. So we're going to look at both patterns. So what we can do, and I don't have a human fetus that was done this way, but I have a little pig fetus that was done this way, where you take the entire fetus, you put them in a solution that makes their tissue transparent, and then you stain cartilage. And by doing that, you can actually see where cartilage exists. So this is a human fetus where that process was done, where you just take the tissue and make it transparent, and then you stain hyaline cartilage. And so everything that's stained really darkly is, I like to say, hyaline cartilage. And so what we can see is that the top of the skull didn't stain darkly. So those cranial bones we learned, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporals, the mandible didn't stain dark, and the clavicle didn't stain dark. And so that's because they're not cartilage, they're actually connective tissue. Where all of our other bones, including our metacarpals here in our hand, our little phalanges, and we can see the same thing in the foot down here with the metatarsals, are all cartilage. And so we actually create our skeleton first for our appendicular skeleton as cartilage, and then we convert it to bone. So tomorrow in lab, I'll have that fetal skeleton out again, so you can look at it. So if you look closely, you'll notice that the ends of the arm bones, the ends of the leg bones are still cartilage. That bone process is far from complete. Yes.
So what would the carpals and tarsals be made out of?
Pardon?
The carpals and the...
They're actually, we make them in cartilage and then remodel them to bone. And if you look at the fetal skeleton, the wrist is totally cartilage. And so it's not been ossified at all. And so it's kind of cool to see. All right. So anytime you want to learn a list, then you got a list to learn. I choose the little list and assume everything else. So if we're looking at intermembranous ossification, then the frontal bone, the two parietal bones, the occipital bone, the two temporal bones. And it's communication between your developing brain and overlying tissue that initiates this ossification process. And so when we do the nervous system, we'll kind of look at that process. But if your brain doesn't develop, then you won't form the bones over your brain. So there are babies born where the brain doesn't develop and the top of their head doesn't develop. And they're usually terminal stillborn babies, because without a brain you can't live. But there are incidences where that occurs, and none of the top bones will develop. So what triggers this developmental sequence is communication between developing tissues. And so as your brain develops, there's a chemical communicator that triggers this ossification process to begin to take place. Right. And then the oddballs are the mandible, so this bone, and then the clavicle, which are the bones here. And those are the ones that develop by intermembranous ossification. Everything else in your body develops by endochondral ossification. So that's the easy way to do it. All right. So what actually happens then is we initiate this process with an immature layer of connective tissue. And so we use mesenchyme as an indicator of this embryonic tissue. So anytime we talk about mesenchymal cells or mesenchymal tissue, we're talking about embryonic tissue that is developing. All right. And then as your brain begins to develop, and your brain actually begins to develop in the 3rd week of gestation. So, and your brain and central nervous system has the longest time frame of development of any of your other organ systems. And it's incomplete when you're born. And you have to continue to maturate your nervous system. So as the brain begins to develop, then the connective tissue that's covering the brain, genes are going to be triggered inside the cells, and then these mesenchymal cells are going to convert to osteoblasts. As they convert to osteoblasts, they'll lay down bone matrix. So the amazing thing about development is, and the thing that if we eventually unravel, we'll be able to totally change medicine, is if we can learn how to turn genes on and off, then we can make any organ. So think about what would happen if we could take mesenchyme cells and make a new heart for somebody who is waiting for a heart transplant from their own tissue. That would be pretty amazing compared to having to wait for a transplant where people die because transplants are available. It would be amazing. Pardon? Yeah, they wouldn't have to be on meds for rejection the rest of their life. Or like a former student of mine, he was impoverished. The state paid for a liver transplant because he had a genetic liver disease that he was born with. And then when he was in my class, he came to school and was all upset. I said, "What's happening?" He said, "Well, the state just told me they're going to stop paying for my anti-rejection drugs." Are you kidding me? They spend several $100,000 to do the transplant, and I'll be rich about it.
Yeah, my dad had a heart transplant. Did the exact same thing to him 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But the thing with those anti-rejection drugs, they actually cause cancer.
There's a lot of side effects
It's
to
a
it.
very high cancer rate. Like my dad got last year got lung cancer and he never smoked a day in his life.
Yeah.
Perfectly healthy.
Yeah, I know. There's the dilemma. But the good news is that usually when people have to have a transplant, usually they're in older age, not always. And so the time frame of longevity because of the transplant versus side effects, usually age is in favor.
Most people never see the side effects because most transplants you can extend their life by 10 years of that.
Right. Okay. So anyway, what's cool is this whole mechanism of development is controlling genes. What genes are turned on and what genes are expressed. Right? So what's going to happen then is that we've got these mesenchymal cells, and so we've got this fibrous embryonic connective tissue. And then what's going to happen is that some of the cells, as they undergo mitosis, are going to be triggered to differentiate into osteoblasts. And then what do osteoblasts do? They lay down bone matrix. So think about this. So what's in bone matrix? The organic matrix. So the cells have to turn on a gene that makes collagen. The ground substance, chondrogen sulfate. So you have to turn on the gene that codes for enzymes that allow you to make that. And in the mineral salts is a crystalline mineral salts, hydroxyapatite. Well, what's absolutely amazing is every cell in your body has the genes for those enzymes. But we have to limit where they get turned on. Because you would not want those genes turned on in skeletal muscle. Or you would ossify all of your skeleton. Yeah. So it's a clever game our body plays of turning on genes in appropriate areas and not in inappropriate areas. So what's actually going to happen is that we're going to begin to lay down bone matrix. And then as the matrix maturates and becomes mature, then the osteoblasts are going to convert to osteocytes. So I have an area of more mature bone. At this point, the osteogenic cells are now at the leading edge of this. And these osteogenic cells are going to convert to osteoblasts. And so what's going to happen is we're going to start at a specific point, and then the bone is going to grow three-dimensionally in all directions. So that at the end, we create a bone from a specific point. So the specific point is called a center of ossification. And we know exactly where most of those centers are, where we know where we started this whole process. Right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make spongy bone. And so the initial bone made is spongy bone. And then as the spongy bone maturates, we're going to remodel the surface to create compact bone. We're going to see that pattern through both types of bone formation, where we always start with spongy bone and then convert it to compact bone. And then we're going to see that exact same pattern when we look at fracture repair. So the fact that we can repair bones and repair fractures, we do it the exact same way we made our bones embryologically. Yeah. So it's just following a pattern that has happened. So what actually happens is this center of ossification is larger, and what we're going to do is we're going to begin to remodel this spongy bone, which is comprised of trabeculae, into compact bone on the surface, and then we're going to retain the spongy bone with trabeculae to the inside. So all those flat bones that we learned on the skull, two parietal bones, frontal bone, two temporal bones, and occipital bone, are actually two layers of compact bone inside and outside of the spongy bone on the inside. And then the tissue to the outside that's going to retain these stem cells for the rest of your life that allows you to remodel bone all the time is the periosteum. So the periosteum becomes the site of these stem cells for the rest of your life.
Did long bones start as spongy bones?
Pardon?
Did long bones start as spongy?
Yeah, but we start as hyaline cartilage, and then we convert the hyaline cartilage to spongy bone, and then remodel spongy bone to compact bone. So it's going to be the same. All right. So this is something that fetal skeleton out, so you can actually see it. I'm going to turn the lights out just for a second because it's a little more visible. So if you look at this, here's the two parietal bones, here's the occipital bone, here's the two frontal bones that you initiate with. Notice that this looks different, and then this looks different, and then this looks different. So if you look subtly, this is different than this, and this is different than both of those. So remember, we started as center, and then we grow bone from the center. So the high points on the skull, this high point here, this high point here, this high point here, this high point here, is the center of ossification. So this is the oldest bone, and we've now converting spongy bone on the surface to compact bone. So it has that nice, smooth surface to it. This, you can actually still see the trabeculae here. So this is largely just spongy bone, where the compact bone hasn't been created on the surface. So when you were actually born, the centers of those bones had already been remodeled to compact bone on the surface, on the inside and outside surface. But the edge of the bone, where the openings we learned, which were called fontanelles, this is all spongy bone still. And then as the spongy bone plates grow together, they create the sutures. So that suture pattern of zigzagging lines is created by trabeculae that then eventually becomes ossified. And you can actually see that in the skeleton. So this was our, which fontanelle? Frontal fontanelle. Posterior fontanelle. Anterior lateral fontanelle. Posterior lateral fontanelle. So what we're actually seeing is these bone plates, the temporal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, and frontal bone, where the bones actually grow. Now what's fascinating is everyone starts with 2 frontal bones, because we start with 2 centers of ossification. And initially we have what would look like a suture plane. But remember, in all the skulls we looked at in lab, only one of them still had a suture going through the frontal bone. So usually we remodel that suture out. But the reason why it exists in that one skull that I showed you is because we actually initially start with 2 frontal bones, left and right. Then we use the fuse them together. Really cool. Yes.
Why would we remodel that suture out?
Probably to make it stronger,
Okay.
would be my guess, although usually if you look at skull fractures, rarely do skull fractures break sutures, but they break bone, and the sutures are really strong. But my guess is, because we go forward all the time, that the most common trauma to the front of the skull was always in the front of the face.
Would it have anything to do with the sinus being there?
It could have the fact that there's a frontal sinus, yes. Okay, so when we look at endochondral ossification, then what we're going to do is start with a hyaline cartilage model, and then we're going to convert it to bone. And so the way to remember it is it's everything except what we just talked about. The roofing bones of the skull, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, mandible, and clavicle. So that means the other bones on your skull, the sphenoid bone, ethmoid bone, maxillary bone, zygomatic bones, are actually created as a hyaline cartilage model first, and then converted to bone. As are all your vertebrae, your ribs, and all your bones that we're going to work on tomorrow in the lab, which will be in your arms and legs. So what we do is we start with a hyaline cartilage model. And so if we kind of follow our pattern of naming, so if we're looking at a long bone like your humerus or your femur, then you'll have this area which is called the diaphysis, and then the 2 ends of the bones which are called epiphysis to begin with. Now, what was one of the tenets we learned about hyaline cartilage? Are there any blood vessels in hyaline cartilage? No. So cartilage is a vascular. So as this cartilage model gets bigger in diameter, then the inside cells have a problem, don't they? So as this hyaline cartilage model grows in diameter and length, the cells to the inside are further away from nutrient gas exchange. So what happened in our skin as the cells got pushed upward away from their source of their blood supply source?
Physiological.
That triggered a gene that made them convert to make keratin, and they did what? They died. So why the green gene got triggered is because the cells became physiologically stressed. Well, the exact thing that's going to happen here is that as this cartilage model gets bigger, the older cells to the inside are going to become physiologically stressed. They're actually going to have trouble getting rid of waste products. So if you have to retrain waste products, you become hypertonic. And if you're hypertonic, what is water going to do? It's going to enter you or exit?
Yes, sir.
Exit.
So if you're a cell and you're hypertonic, you have more solutes
And less water.
water. Your interstitial fluid out here, if it is hypotonic, has less solutes, more water. Osmosis is simply the diffusion of water through a
Membrane.
cell membrane, and diffusion always occurs from an area of
High concentration.
higher
of
concentration to. So where's water more concentrated?
outside the cell.
So which direction is it going to go?
Inside the cell.
Thank you. All right. So if you're a cell and you're hypertonic, you're going to take on
Water.
which is going to make you do what?
Swell.
Swell. Look at how big the atolls are getting. Because the cells are swelling. Yeah. And then if you're a cell, it's just not a good thing to swell. Because eventually you're going to die. Yes. So what actually happens is these old cells begin to die. But dying cells send signals that they're dying. That's how white blood cells know they're supposed to go eat them. So what actually happens is there's a signal that there's some chemical signals that are beginning to occur. And what actually happens is one of the things that's inside the cell is calcium. So if you're already hypertonic, if you can get rid of something, you want to get rid of calcium, so you dump calcium to the outside. But as you dump calcium to the outside, then your soluble out here becomes dominated by calcium, which actually makes the diffusion of substances even worse. So eventually it gets to the point where the matrix becomes calcified, and as the matrix becomes calcified, the cell is dying because they can't exchange at all. Dead cells send signals, and what actually happens is blood vessels migrate in because the blood vessels carry new white blood cells. Yeah, they destroy the old matrix, and then osteogenic cells migrate in, convert to osteoblasts, and you begin to lay down bone matrix. Isn't that cool? So what you begin to do is develop your bone at the center of the diaphysis. And then what happens is the diaphysis becomes compact bone. And we do this very early on because we need a maxillary cavity, because baby has got to make sure there are reservoirs on board in case mom's not producing enough milk for the little one, so that they have this enormous energy reserve to live on for a few days. And so all the diaphysis of all the bones are hollow, and the baby's stored as brown fatty. Now, if you look at the fetal skeleton tomorrow, you'll notice, particularly if you look at the humerus and you look at the femur, that the ends of the bone are still cartilage. So you're actually born at this point where you've got this primary center of ossification that has developed compact bone. But what you have at each end of the bone in the epiphysis is still hyaline cartilage. So the bone's growing, so that cartilage is growing in size. So we're gonna just create the same problem again, where the inside cells in the epiphysis become physiologically stressed because they can't exchange material well. They eventually die. As they die, blood vessels migrate into the area, destroy the old matrix using osteoclasts, and then osteogenic cells migrate in. So what we're going to end up with is two secondary centers of ossification, one at the proximal epiphysis and one at the distal epiphysis. So we end up with a primary center of ossification, which was in the diaphysis. We ossify the diaphysis, and we end up with cartilage at the end of our bones. It's still growing. We undergo the same process where those cells become physiologically stressed. They die, blood vessels migrate in, and then we start these secondary centers of ossification. So we begin to create spongy bone on the inside of the distal epiphysis and the proximal epiphysis. As this continues, we're going to create spongy bone clear to the surface. And then what's amazing in long bones is we retain the hyaline cartilage in the joint space, and we retain a band of hyaline cartilage trapped between the diaphysis and the epiphysis that we call a epiphyseal plate. And that epiphyseal plate is what we commonly call a growth plate. And the reason why you can continue to grow after you're born till your adult stature is that you trapped this embryonic cartilage inside the bone. And as long as you have this embryonic cartilage, your bones can still grow. So the reason why we stop growing is the embryonic cartilage eventually gets converted to bone. And once that embryonic cartilage is converted to bone, you can no longer, your bones can no longer grow in bone. It's an amazing story. It's so cool. So here's an X-ray of a baby. Okay. And so this is their pelvis we're looking at here. Here is the diaphysis of the femur. And then tomorrow we're going to learn some bumps on the femur. So this big bump out here is called the greater trochanter. This smaller bump right here is the lesser trochanter, that we're going to learn tomorrow in the class. This is all cartilage. So in an X-ray, the X-ray doesn't penetrate through bone. So the radiation doesn't penetrate through bone, so it gets bounced back. But it penetrates cartilage like it doesn't exist. So an X-ray works because you got a film underneath, and where the X-ray hits the film, it makes the film black. Where the X-rays don't hit the film, it makes the film white. And so that's how X-rays work, where we get the image of the bone because it's bouncing back the X-rays. In this instance, this whole area is dark because it was penetrating it. And that's because the head of the femur at this point is still cartilage. And this little round thing is that secondary center of ossification. So when you look at the fetal skeleton tomorrow, when you look at the end of the bone, it's all cartilage. What we can't see is inside. We've already started that process of ossification. So we already have our secondary center of ossification. It's already formed. Isn't that cool? And so this vein of cartilage right here is being trapped. It's going to eventually be our growth plate. That's going to continue to allow us to grow as we mature. So this is an X-ray with a child with a fractured femur up here. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the distal end of the femur and the proximal end of the big big bone in your lower leg, which is your tibia. Okay. So here's the growth plate. Here's that secondary center of ossification. Here's the growth plate, and here's that secondary center of ossification. So you see, when you're born, most of the material in your knee is still cartilage. So the bones that form your knee are largely still cartilage. And what we've developed is those secondary centers of ossification in them. So cool to look at. So what we're going to talk about is how we grow. All right. And then the thing to think about is we're going to grow by continuing to convert cartilage to bone. So we're going to go through the same process where the cartilage is going to become physiologically stressed. It's going to be converted to spongy bone, and then eventually on the surface is converted to compact bone as we grow. Because the growth plate and those events that are occurring, we can take a growth plate and we can divide it into zones. So the zone of resting cartilage is going to look perfectly like hyaline cartilage. And as long as you have a zone of resting cartilage, you can continue to grow. But as that zone of resting cartilage becomes thickened in the growth process, then we're going to see some things that happen. So the first thing that's going to happen is, as the cartilage grows, the cells undergo mitosis. So they're going to increase in number. Because the cells are trapped in lacuna, because of the matrix around them, the new daughter cells get trapped in the same space. And so remember when we looked at hyaline cartilage, and what I showed you in lab was that the areas where the hyaline cartilage was at the last growth stages of that hyaline cartilage, we would see two cells a lot trapped in the same lacuna. So what's going to happen in that area, we're going to see cell after cell being trapped in the lacuna. So we call it the zone of proliferating cartilage, because we can see an increase in cell number in the cartilage itself. And then at this point, we're getting further away from blood supply. So the cells become hypertonic. As they become hypertonic, they swell. So what term did we use in the first unit that meant an increase in size of cells in a tissue?
Hypertrophy.
Hypertrophy. So we'll see a zone of hypertrophic cartilage where the cells are increasing in size. As the cells become more physiologically stressed, they release calcium, and the matrix becomes more rigid. And so we'll see a zone of calcified matrix. And so the resting cartilage is always closest to the developing epiphyseal center of ossification. So here the zone of resting cartilage would be right at this edge. Here the zone of resting cartilage would be right at this edge. So these plates are reverse order from the proximal epiphysis to the distal epiphysis. So on the proximal epiphysis, the zone of resting cartilage would be closest to the epiphysis, and the distal epiphysis is going to be flipped because the zone of resting cartilage is still closest to the epiphysis. Okay? So these plates are reversed depending on whether you're looking at proximal or distal epiphysis. So, kind of as an overview, it's kind of hard to begin to see all of it. So what I did is start with the edge of the zone of resting cartilage. So typically in the zone of resting cartilage, you see a lot of single cartilage cells in lacuna. And then toward the edge of the zone of resting cartilage, you'll begin to see a lot of two chondrocytes in lacuna. So notice that up here we have a single cell in lacuna, single cell in lacuna, single cell. But as I move toward this, now I have two cells a lot in the lacuna. So as we move into the zone of resting cartilage, the cells undergo mitosis. So if you start with one cell and you undergo mitosis, you end up with 2. If you have 2 cells, you end up with 4. If you have 4 cells, you end up with 8. If you have 8 cells, you end up with 16. So as you go through the zone of proliferating cartilage, you can actually see 4 cells trapped here, 8 cells trapped here, and you can see 16 cells trapped down here. So the zone of proliferating cartilage, these cells are undergoing rapid mitosis and giving rise to new populations. Because the matrix is dense, the cells get trapped in these linear relationships. And so what really characterizes the zone of proliferating cartilage is these long lines of cells that are all trapped together. So remember, the blood supply is way up there, or way down here. So in this boundary right here, the cells are rapidly increasing, which means we have more mouths to feed. But we have more mouths to feed, but we can't do it as well because we're further away from blood supply. So that makes the cells become stressed. And as they become stressed, they retain waste products. As they retain waste products, they swell. So notice in this zone, starting about right here, you notice how these cells are held tightly together. And now there's big more open space between the cells. Those cells are actually swelling in size. So where the cells are swelling here, and they're getting bigger and bigger, is the zone of hypertrophy cartilage. Well, just like when we were talking about doing this initially, swelling is not a good thing when you're a cell. And it usually leads to your demise. So the cells begin to die. Right before they die, they try to start liberating a bunch of calcium. So the matrix becomes more solid around the cells. But unfortunately, that makes diffusion even more problematic, and the cells die. As the cells die in the zone of the calcified matrix, new cells migrate in from the existing bone, and we begin to lay down what kind of bone? Spongy bone. So we're going to go from what looks typically like hyaline cartilage here to this developing spongy bone in the metaphysis. And that allows our bones then to grow. So our bones actually grow from the diaphysis in both directions. So when you grew in height, let's say your legs grew an inch, that meant that you did a half an inch at the top, half an inch at the bottom, roughly. Yeah. And your bone grew in both directions.
Is the cell programmed specifically to get rid of calcium at the end, or is that just something that's easy to get rid of?
My guess is that it's probably programmed for that. I have to look that up. But it's something that's typically an imbalance between the outside and inside of the cells. Okay. So this is pulling back so we can't see things as well, but we can see the overall pattern. So this is the end of the diaphysis over here. This is classic spongy bone. So what are these ridges called? Trabeculae. And then this is classic bone marrow, real granular red bone marrow here. This is compact bone on the outside. This is the membrane that covers the outside of the bone, which is the periosteum. So you can see the periosteum bone here, compact bone on the outside. So this is our growth plate. Our epiphysis is over here. So this is my zone of resting privilege. Again, lots of randomly organized cells. We get into this area, we begin to see two cells. So we know this is where the cells are undergoing mitosis. And then we begin to see these stacks of cells in this area. So this is my zone proliferating privilege. Here we see the cells increasing in size. So this is my zone of hypertrophy privilege. And here we begin to get this dense matrix surrounding the cells. So this is my zone of calcified matrix. So starting from one end and going toward, and then eventually this calcified matrix is converted to
spongy bone.
And that's how we grew. And we did that for 15, 16 years if you're female, 18, 19, 20 years if you're male. So this is the patterns that we just talked about. So this is zone of calcified matrix. All right. So once we stop growing in height, that doesn't mean that our bones can't continue to grow in diameter. Because the more muscle mass we put on, the more our bones typically grow in diameter. So that's one way that forensic pathologists for years have been able to look at skeletal remains and come up with whether it's a male or a female. Is typically the diameter of the bones. Because men typically have a greater muscle mass, and their bones tend to be thicker in diameter. That's also why, as we look at the aging process, we see women having problems with osteoporosis earlier than men, even though both men and women can actually develop and have problems with osteoporosis. Is that typically men are starting that elderly period of their life with a larger bone mass. So what's going to happen is we're going to retain our osteogenic cells on the inside of our periosteum. So these periosteal cells are actually going to be able to be converted from osteogenic cells to osteoblasts. And then osteoblasts are going to lay down matrix. So what was the matrix on our outside of our bone called? So it went around the bone. Circumferential, outer circumferential lamellae. So what we're essentially going to do is make more layers of outer circumferential lamellae. And as we do that, we're actually going to trap blood vessels. As we trap blood vessels, then osteons are going to grow around trapped blood vessels. And so it's going to be a very similar pattern, but just slightly different. So let's look at the pattern. So what we're doing is we're making new layers of outer circumferential lamellae. The periosteum of bone is highly vascular. And so as we make these new layers of circumferential lamellae, they create little ridges around blood vessels. As we continue to do that, we eventually begin to trap the blood vessel. And as we trap the blood vessel, and we continue to make more layers of circumferential lamellae, then around the trapped blood vessel, we begin to make these, which are concentric lamellae. So as our bone grows in diameter, we keep pushing the circumferential lamellae outside, and as we trap blood vessels, then those areas convert to creating concentric lamellae. So this one's going to be trapped here pretty quick. As the bone continues to go outward, we're going to make a new osteon here. And so that assures that as we increase the bone's diameter, we only have a number of layers of circumferential lamellae before we begin to convert to osteons to the inside of it. So that's what you're seeing here, where this one continued. So now we've got new layers going out. So we trap this blood vessel. Now we're going to be able to convert this to concentric lamellae around this trapped blood vessel. So the trapped blood vessel now becomes a central canal or a Haversian canal. So what do we need as we go through life? So what did we need as a little tiny baby as we were constructing this adult skeletal system? And then what do we need as we go through life to maintain our skeletal system so that at the end of life we still have a functioning skeleton that allows for movement and other things? So there's basically 4 different things we're going to look at. Minerals, of which calcium is a critical one to continue this process. Vitamins that we take allow our body to do certain things. And vitamins oftentimes are eventually linked to enzymes as coenzymes that allow enzyme action to occur. Our body maintains homeostasis through the nervous system and the endocrine system. So bone growth and the homeostasis of your skeleton is driven by hormones, and hormones drive that process. And there's a direct connection between muscle mass and bone health. And the more exercise you do, the more healthy your skeleton, which is really something that we've just began to understand with elderly people. And almost every new care facility being built actually now has gyms and swimming pools so that they can get these people and do exercise to slow down the onset of and continued progression of bone diseases. Absolutely. Right. So the most important mineral you need to make your hydroxyapatite crystal is calcium. All right. So what we use is calcemia as a relative term for blood levels of calcium. So if we put hypo in front of it, then you would be at a low blood level of calcium. So anytime your body is in a long-term hypocalcemic event, you're going to rob calcium out of your bones continually to try to elevate blood calcium. Because your nervous system, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle all is dependent upon calcium to function. Right? So if you want to maintain a good skeleton, then periodically, because of your diet, you need to be in a state of hypercalcemia, because then that will cause you to deposit calcium into bone matrix. So the one thing you need to do through life is try to avoid as much long-term hypocalcemic events. All right? So the way to do that is to ingest calcium. So what are good sources of calcium? Well, we know dairy products are. That's what everybody tells us. So if you actually look at dairy products and you compare milk, low-fat milk, skim milk, then actually your best bet on dairy products is yogurt. And that makes sense because yogurt is just simply milk with most of the water in it. So you're concentrating what's in the milk into a smaller unit. So a good source of calcium is yogurt. So another excellent source of calcium would be sardines. Why sardines? Yeah, because they're pressure cooked with their bones, and you're ingesting their bones. So now a really good breakfast would be yogurt and sardines.
What about absorption in your body absorbed? Like,
You were going to talk about calcium. Not all calcium is equally absorbable, and you actually do need vitamin D to absorb it. We're going to talk about that mix here in a little bit. So right now we're just thinking, well, if you're going to be concerned about this in the future, and particularly as you age. And so I was once young and I never worried about it. Now I worry about it a little bit. Yeah. So ricotta cheese, because it's milk concentrated again, would be an excellent way. So if you want to make a really good lasagna, then you could use ricotta cheese with a little yogurt and have sardine lasagna. And that would be really good. And then for dessert, you could have ricotta cheese yogurt with figs. You think they would have That's funny, because years ago I taught in a different school, and the chair of the department used to love sardines. So when he retired, I thought I'd get his goat, so I went to the local pizza place, because we were going to have a pizza party for him, and I had him make him a sardine pizza. And the rest of it's good. We loved it. So. All right, so tomorrow